Hi, my name is Martin Purnell and welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, a weekly podcast for those who go or don't go to church and where we can meet and hear from those that have made their faith count. This podcast series is to encourage via conversation, and you can contact us by email ogc@accessradio.biz. That's ogc@accessradio.biz, and biz is spelled B-I-Z. Our website, by the way, is www.offgridchristianity.co.uk, and please hit the subscribe button if you haven't already done so. It means a lot. Thank you. So, who's today's guest? Well, she trained as a social worker in her native Australia. She lived in Thailand, is now based in Birmingham, UK. As an author, she wrote her autobiography with a great title of Missionary, Not Just a Position. In this book, she shares about faith and doubt, as well as raising her children in difficult places. Our guest is a United Reformed minister, and you might be aware of her husband Ash, who was also a previous guest in episode 114. And wow, what a podcast that was. I thought it'd be a good idea to invite Ash's wife as a guest, not only to give a different perspective into their joint project, see again episode 114, but also to find out the other issues she is passionate about. So why is she passionate about social justice? Why is she passionate about fighting for the marginalised? What were her periods of doubt and what caused them? How does she cope with raising a young family in a strange at first land? What has she learned from her mistakes, and what has she learned from her strengths and assets? And finally, is she also a baggy like her old man? All these questions deserve answers. Gives me great pleasure to welcome the Reverend Anji Barker, but I'm sure I can call her Anji. Anji, thanks for joining us today. Where are you based?
No worries, Martin. Thanks. It's great to be with you. So I'm based in Birmingham in Winson Green. Today I'm speaking to you from the URC West Midlands Synod office. But mostly my work is in Winson Green, Handsworth area, which is the northwest of Birmingham.
For those that are saying, oh, that's definitely an Australian accent, whereabouts in Australia are you from originally?
A long, long time ago, I was from Melbourne in Australia, but I haven't lived there for quite a long time. So, yeah.
It's almost the same, Melbourne and Winson Green, I would have thought. Same kind of weather patterns, same beaches.
People laugh. For about 6 months of the year, the weather is the same.
Oh, is it?
So when it overlaps from autumn into, we're autumn here and there's spring there is a lot of weather temperature that's the same, because Melbourne's on the south coast and it has the very cold water from the Southern Ocean coming up. But when it's hot, it's hot. When it's cold, it's not quite as cold as Birmingham.
Are you going to tell me then that you can't go into the ocean in Melbourne because it's cold?
Well, I didn't go often. It was very cold. Yeah, it's water straight off the South Pole. Yeah, but when people imagine the warmth of Australia, they're normally thinking of Queensland, of Sydney and North, which is very tropical. But Australia is so large, it has so many weather patterns. But we do have warm days in Melbourne and warmer days than we'd have in Birmingham, but not as cold as Birmingham winter. But really, I moved here from Thailand and that's the weather I miss. Yeah. So it's very different to living in Thailand. Yeah.
No doubt we'll talk about that later on, or maybe not. Maybe we'll have so much to discuss. Who knows where we'll end up? Could be one of those podcasts again. So let's start off as we always do then with 5 maybe not so important questions. See how we get on. Fingers on the buzzers, no conferring, please, Anji. Question number 1, if you could invite anybody from history for an evening meal, alive or dead, so that you could ask them questions, who would it be?
Well, I thought a lot about this, and obviously there's loads of people that come to mind, the obvious people, but I think I would really like to have a conversation with a newly freed slave. Often, because we work a lot with asylum seekers, and I think there's some similarity there. And just the thought that, when we look back at history and we think about, finally people did the right thing and recognised slavery as wrong and set slaves free. And we kind of end the story there a lot, particularly from a white perspective. But I think about what were they freed to? What was there for them and how tough life must have been? And I'd love to know what were the next steps? Because what we find with asylum seekers that have been waiting 7 years to get their permission to stay, we have this celebratory day where they get that magical letter from the Home Office. And I know deep in my heart as we celebrate that tomorrow there will be tears. It's almost that joy in the morning and then comes the sorrow because they then become homeless. They then get moved around. They then battle the welfare system. They then have no power and control over where their children can go to school as they keep getting moved all the time. And I think about that in terms of, how we idolise kind of poverty in a way where we say, well, we've solved that and we've freed these people. And in Thailand, we had a similar idea where lots of Christian groups back in the early 2000s were very intent on rescuing women from sex work, but with very little understanding of what were we rescuing people to and the hopelessness and despair that was what actually trafficked them. And we placing people back. So that got me thinking about a conversation with newly freed slaves and what were the challenges and what were the issues that they faced that they probably didn't expect to face. Yeah.
Well, that is not just a phenomenal answer, but I think in all my years of doing this, and we're going back into the 1990s, you are the first person, I think, who's chosen somebody that we've never heard of before, as in nobody famous, even mildly famous. Slaves can be from BC or current day. So I can get my time machine to work. Where are we going back to get the slave?
Interestingly, last week I stayed at Martin Luther King House in Manchester, and we did a whole series on dreaming. And just, I guess, from that era, from before his time, so I guess 50 years before him in the south of America. I don't know. I'm really bad on history and dates. I didn't pay much attention in school. So maybe, 100 years ago are we talking?
Let's play safe. Let's go
200 years ago in southern America. Yeah, the cotton fields. I'm thinking particularly of those kind of cotton picking and those big estates. Yeah, that's 200 years ago, isn't it? Gosh, I'm getting old. I've missed about 50 years. Yeah. That kind of era, I was thinking, and somebody said to me, we were talking about this last week, for so many of those initial slaves that were freed in the south of America, they stayed with their former slave owners, and they used that as an excuse to say, so they can't have been that bad. And my feeling, and I think that's what sparked this kind of thought, is they literally had nowhere else to go.
Yeah.
All of their working life, they would receive no money. They had nothing. So sometimes what we see and what the reality is can be two different things, I think. And I think that's still true today in so many circumstances. And slavery hasn't ended. Modern day slavery is endemic right across the world and driven by the West because we want cheap sugar and we want cheap food and cheap clothes. And we continue to create that kind of opportunity for modern day slavery and then we have the gall to then say we're going to go and rescue people when we might have been the cause of it in the first place. But yeah.
Very quickly, what would you cook the slave or slaves if we brought a couple out?
Well, I don't cook. I'm a really bad cook and Uber Eats wasn't around back then. So yes, I'd have to rely on the kindness of strangers. And one of the things, when it comes to food, I remember when we first moved into the slum in Thailand, you cannot outgive the poor. They are the most generous people in the world with the very little they have. And I think, the Bible story of the widow's mite, it really is our Christian history of that, and that is that I'm sure they would, even in their situation, would have food. So food to give me, which I don't deserve.
Wow.
Yeah.
Who's your favourite biblical character for question 2 then, please, Angie? Or your favourite biblical story or your favourite parable?
There's some quite problematic characters in the Bible, isn't there?
Only a few.
Yeah. There's that guy, I can't remember his name, that king that died on the toilet. He was stabbed while he was on the toilet. Somebody in the Old Testament, but he's not a favourite. But I think my favourite story, and again, they're all problematic, really, the stories in the Bible and how they're written in our modern language. But the story I really love the imagery of is in Matthew 22, the wedding banquet, where the guy sets up his wedding banquet and then he invites all his mates, but they're all busy doing things. They're busy with life. Of course, we can't relate to that at all at the moment. And then he sends his servants out to invite everybody, the poor, the people on the streets. And the image for me is that he went and invited people who don't normally get invited to have a seat at the table, because the people who were always invited were too busy and didn't understand the privilege that they had. And so they didn't take that opportunity. And for me, it's an image of the church that for so long the church has spent all its energy inviting the people who always get invited. And they're not interested. And actually, that to me is a season to invite people to the centre who normally get missed out in our invitations. People on the margins, the really unlikely people in our neighbourhoods with gifts and talents that nobody's recognised yet. It gets problematic when, because they weren't dressed right, he beat them up. He got the servants to beat them up. I don't like the second half, but yeah, we do a lot of that proof texting when we read Bible, don't we? But I also think that's also an image that when we do invite people from the margins, we then can sometimes emotionally and beat them up because we want them to behave and fit into our Christian culture rather than express what their faith means to them in their own unique way. So that's the way I kind of live with the second half of that. The journey that I'm on is about giving the communities their churches back, and that's very much my role in this job at the URC, is to look where there's churches that are in rapid decline, open the doors and allow the neighbourhood to dream and re-enter in their own way and not in a pre-prescribed way that we determine, because they're not our buildings. they were paid for by working class people 100 years ago, giving their tithes and offerings. And then they've been hijacked by structure and organisation and sets of rules. So that's why I really love that passage. That's what's really inspired the framework of how I think.
Do you know what? I want to come back to that as well, if that's all right, in a few
sure.
minutes' time, especially in light of the latest news that there seems to be a growth in church attendance at the moment. So we can find out what you think on that, whether it's true or not.
Yeah.
Watch this space.
Yeah.
Question 3. If you were Prime Minister for the day, this is going to be interesting. Now, actually, you can choose, Angie. You can either be Prime Minister of Australia, because they have a different one every week, or you can have one in the UK. Where do you want to be?
Oh, it's a poison chalice, isn't it, that one?
Yeah.
I think I'd like to change a law and impose a new law.
But you have to be Prime Minister. You're going to go Australia or UK. You have to be one of the two.
Well, both countries. I think this law would be valid. And I know this is inspired by a Green senator in Australia, actually. The law would be that as a politician, you can't own more than 2 properties. And so that would then mean that all of proper housing policy would come through. But because our politicians and our leaders, people with the power to change this terribly unfair housing policies that we have, are all making money from it as landlords, I feel like that colours their willingness to change housing law. And, you know, in Australia, I think the Green senator said he is the only senator, the only politician who is a renter. Everybody else is a homeowner. So how can you possibly understand the housing crisis we have if you have no close relationship to it, and actually you yourself are an investor who has 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 houses making money from our failed housing policy?
I'm going to have to stop you there because you're getting too sensible. Stop it. We can't have that. We can't have a sensible Prime Minister.
We need to have sacrificial leadership, and that way you don't have those vested interests. Yeah. I mean, take a free ticket to Taylor Swift. I don't mind that. But what I'm saying is we focus on, you know, clothing gifts and those things, but actually nobody's asking the really obvious question in this housing crisis in the UK is why did the no-fault evictions not get passed in the last parliament? That would be my law. Politicians can own 1 house and 1 investment property, and that's it.
And you're allowed a frivolous one as well.
Yeah.
What would you go for?
I think you should have more McDonald's in the UK. I blame Jamie Oliver. I can't get a country of a population of this size. In Australia, we have a McDonald's on every corner. I was like, where are they? Yeah, so you've got to drive across town to find your Mackie D's. And by the time you get your Uber Eats, the chips are soggy. Yeah, so there you go. That would be my other one.
Brilliant. I do actually have a problem with Keir Starmer getting tickets for Taylor Swift because he should have gone to a rock concert instead.
No, you're talking to a Tay-Tay fan, so sorry.
Good stuff. Question 4. Outside of family events, Angie, what has been your most enjoyable day out, please?
I've done so many weird and wacky things on days out that I couldn't even begin. But one for the UK, in my time in the UK, is I went to Damnation Festival at the Leeds University. Don't tell my mother because it sounds not very Christian. And what that was is it was not heavy metal, but death metal festival. And I had a friend who was in charge of selling Terrorizer magazine, which wasn't great given I was a newly arrived migrant at the same time. So I thought if this flags up on my background search, I could be in trouble. But basically was invited along to go and help them sell this magazine at this festival. And, you know, all the kind of questions you have about, you know, upside down crosses and sacrificing of chickens and, you know, all that stuff. And actually, it was the most incredible experience entering into someone else's culture and seeing this amazing sense of community that they welcomed me in at the centre. And I made all these new friends and just seeing it was a church for these people. And there wasn't all this upside down crosses. Abbott was the main attraction, and Abbott looks like Gene Simmons from Kiss, but the music is so deep that you think your heart is going to explode, the dong, dong, dong in your heart. And, you know, all this, you know, extended tongue out with the full Gene Simmons makeup. But in that, there was a group of people that this was their belonging in their home, just celebrating. And it was really wholesome. It was actually really wholesome. And I thought, this is where Christians should be, in this community. And I just watched how we were asked to take care of different people. And there was just this real kind of pastoral care. I was not expecting it at all. And yeah, so that was an amazing 24-hour day out.
It's funny because death metal now is different to the death metal that I knew in the earlier days, where death metal meant it was like almost satanic. I mean, most of it now isn't at all.
No, but that image is still there. There was one band, I had to buy their T-shirt for a friend, and it was the atheist God-hating, church-hating, non-believing something and something. And they were the nicest guys ever. And I actually got chatting to them because someone told them I was a minister. And they don't have a problem with God at all. They're really angry at the church. They came from Sweden, I think, and they'd been excluded because we weren't allowed to play drums in the church. I wish I could remember the thing on the back of their T-shirt. Probably not a good idea to have worn that T-shirt to a Christian conference a bit later on. I didn't go down that one. But my thing is letting people express their heart and realising actually people are not angry at God. People are desperate for faith and purpose and belief, but we have done a lot of damage as a church.
Absolutely.
And we need to step into that space boldly and say, don't blame God for us. We haven't always got it right. But actually, most of the time we get it wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. And my kids used to say, oh, church is boring. I'm like, church is boring, but God's not boring. So don't blame him or her. Yeah.
That's a great answer. On the music front, because obviously that has been my life. When it comes to death metal, and for those going, oh, no, I'm thinking switch off. Don't switch off this podcast. It's very quick. But the actual musical content of it, whilst I can't actually stand that kind of genre.
Yeah.
And all that, I can't get it. You listen to the musicianship of some of the guitar playing, and also being a drummer myself, there is some incredible drumming out there.
Well, there was a band from Australia, actually, and they played violins as part of their death metal. It was incredible. The stage movement, the music. And that's what I wasn't expecting. I was expecting a whole lot of like nasty, horrible people headbanging and ripping heads off chickens. Remember, heavy metal rockers have got old, haven't they? So now they're bringing their kids and grandkids. It was like a whole family outing. Again, something I just hadn't understood I was going to see. So I really love it when you go on a day out and it takes you in a completely different direction to what you thought it was going to be.
Great stuff. Last question then before we get into the nitty gritty. Anji, what has been your most embarrassing moment, please?
I'll have loads and loads. I'm just one. My life is one big embarrassment. I don't read a room. I put my foot in it all the time. But probably one that kind of has a meaning to me that's really stayed with me. I remember when we were living in Thailand and my son was about 6 months old. I was just walking along through the slum and we had that passage of the Good Samaritan somewhere we'd been, I can't remember where. And I remember thinking, you can live amongst poor people and as a Christian, as a missionary, I hate that term now, but we used that term back then, and be that person that walks the other side of the road. So that had obviously gone through my head that morning. And I'm walking along and I saw a homeless guy that we knew, he was always around our area of the slum, but he was lying in the full sun, face down on a bit of concrete. And I sort of got closer and I could see his back. And I thought, I don't think he's breathing. I think he might be dead. And I squatted down next to him and rolled him over. And as I did that, it woke him up. He screamed out of fright with this white ghost looking at him. I screamed, my son started screaming, he ran off down the road and it was so embarrassing. And because in Thailand, there's thousands of people everywhere. Everybody looked at me and I'm just standing there red-faced. So it was really embarrassing. I thought, oh, we get carried away with yourself, Angie. You think, you're going to be the Good Samaritan. And then about 2 or 3 weeks later, we went to an event. We were pulling our motorbike up just in this little dark alley parking. And I remember Ash saying, oh, look, someone's lying there. Do you think they're all right? Out of the embarrassment of the other and not wanting to create another scene, I was like, look, they're fine. Off we went to what we were doing. When we came back a couple of hours later, the area was taped off, there were police, and that guy had actually died. And it just made me think about, out of embarrassment, we missed so many opportunities. I don't know how long they'd been dead for, all of that, we didn't get involved. We missed so many opportunities because we live in the embarrassment of our last experience. It's not out of unkindness, and it made me rethink that passage that we always think about, the Pharisee walking on the other side of the road. I always thought he just didn't want to get dirty. But I think it's often out of fear and embarrassment that we're not quite sure what to do. And so, it's probably not my funniest, most embarrassing moment, but there's plenty of those, but they're all out there. And if you want to hear any more, read my book, because that's just basically full of all my embarrassing stories.
That's actually a very poignant story and makes us think as well. Once bitten, twice shy is the expression, but hey, just because you didn't like it first time doesn't mean you're not going to like it the second time. So,
yeah, true.
Very good points made. Thank you very much indeed, Angie. Right, well, okay. Where should we go then? Do you know what? I just fancy throwing everything out the window.
Yep.
I have to say, your book title, brilliant. No doubt it's turned a few heads, including your mum, who you mentioned earlier on.
And there were certain radio stations that didn't understand it is intentionally a double entendre. So for those of you who don't know, my book is called Missionary, Not Just a Position. And I think I wanted to write honestly about how we do need to laugh at ourselves and embarrassment and laugh, and also to start to see ourselves in the context as Christians. And at that time, deconstructing and trying to reconstruct into a healthier form of my faith. And that book was very much part of it. And just to put it all out there. And I remember in the 80s and 90s, we would hear all these great, amazing speakers and all these amazing things they're doing. And that kind of led us to want to go and live in a slum in Thailand. And so in early 2000s, that's where we went. We thought we were going to save the world. We thought we were bringing God in our pocket to dark places. That was the rhetoric we used.
Wow.
We know very differently now that God is at work in all of his creation, and it's our privilege to go and find where he's at work and join in. But back in those days, it was very much a going and doing to people. But one of the things very early on that started to crack that for me was the whole idea of Christian urban myths. And that was, we would every couple of years come back to Australia and speak in churches, and often you'd have someone sharing a testimony or something before you, and just thinking about the things people were sharing. And I have a little bit of a ball dust detector. I'll clean it up for UK radio. Some of the stories being told, I just was like, yeah, I call BS on that. I don't believe that. I'm not sure I believe that. And I've always kept that to myself. There was all these stories in the late 80s and early 2000s about whole prisons coming to faith in South America so they don't need jailers. But when you start to follow those stories down, it got very thin very quickly. And I don't know if you're old like me to remember Mike Wonke, who was a famous Christian comedian who got very famous for coming out of the drugs and the Jesus People days, coming to faith. And he was a funny stand-up telling his story. And it turned out all to be BS.
Oh, really?
A lot of that stuff was being unmasked. In more modern times, there was the guy, it was a dream. What was that book? A Chinese man. And that was proven to not be true as well. But anyway, there's lots of Christian kind of stories that unfold. The tsunami had happened in Thailand, and we were speaking at a quite well-known, almost mega church in Australia. And just before we got up, and it was a few months, probably 6 months after the tsunami in Southeast Asia, and somebody got up and shared how they were missionaries in Indonesia, and that they shared a story from Banda Aceh, which was, as we know, devastated by that tsunami. Hundreds of thousands of people killed on that day. The whole area was completely written off. And they said that the Christians in that very Muslim town asked to have a Christmas Eve and a Christmas Day service, and the Muslim leaders had said no. And so in order to have their Christmas service, the Christians went up to hide in the mountains to have the service. And then, of course, on Boxing Day, while they were up there having their Christmas Day service and Boxing Day, the tsunami hit. And so the Christians were all saved and the Muslims all died. It was basically, if you take that to its logical conclusion. And I remember my daughter, she was 9 or something at the time. She goes, but Mum, that doesn't make any sense. Wouldn't it be better for the Christians to die and the Muslims to be saved if God's a God of love? We're going to heaven anyway. And I remember thinking, yeah, I call BS on that. So I started to track down, where did this story originate from?
Yeah.
It was completely made up. It's not true. But the Christian urban myth thing is really big, and it was very big in the 80s and 90s.
Yes.
And so I realised that as soon as you tell your story out of context, so we lived in a slum, I was involved nursing AIDS patients, dealing with really extreme things, but as soon as you tell that story out of context, it becomes a bit of a Christian urban myth. No matter how honest you try to tell it, you don't tell the failures, you don't tell the struggles, you don't tell the doubts and the things you're thinking. So that was really the inspiration for the book, to try and write my story as honestly and as broken as I could and make myself very vulnerable. In saying that, when it was done and it was delivered some copies to my house, I literally threw up because I remembered the things I put in it. And I thought, I can't take them back now. It's out there.
Yeah, the fact that you're from New Zealand and you're not Australian at all, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But no, so it was very cathartic for me and really helped me in deconstructing, I think, from what I would describe as high control religion. I was discipled, came to faith in the 80s, went to Bible college in the 80s, was doing ministry in 90s, 2000. I think that was a societal time where high control life happened. And so our Christian movements across all denominations, across all expressions of faith, was kind of what I call a form of high control religion, where we thought if we just help people do the right things, they would then believe the right things, and then the right things would happen. And I don't think it was out of malice, but I think that the carnage and the damage we now see and the massive move in deconstruction in my age group and those slightly younger than me comes out of people realising that they were part of this high-controlled kind of doing things to type theology, which Jesus was kicked out of and wasn't welcomed in and was killed by. I think it comes from bringing in business principles into church growth models. So I think in the 80s and particularly late 80s and early 90s, we added 11th and 12th commandments of thou shalt not take any risks, thou shalt be organised, thou shalt be as professional as possible. And then those business models of if we just have, I think it was around the time of the 7 Habits, wasn't it? Everybody did 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, wasn't it? And Stephen Covey, he was a guy with a Christian background, but he brought out a book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And it was really a business book, but the church just took it on board. We did. And so as we started to take on those business capitalistic models, I think we created a church that we Jesus and created a quite unrecognisable faith that is not sustainable. And so the excitement I have at the moment is so many people reconstructing into a more generous faith, a more freeing faith that doesn't try to control people and tell them what to believe, but is more concerned about how we follow this God that we say we believe in than what we say we believe.
Do you know what? You're ticking all my boxes here. I'll tell you why. Ever since I became a Christian reluctantly in 1987, it's always been my bugbear about how gullible Christians are. So much so that my testimony is really boring, and I've shared it a few times in previous podcasts. So one day I was put on the spot by an American in a room full of teenagers. Tell me, Martin, tell me your testimony. I thought, right. I just made it up on the spot how I survived a plane crash and everything else. And you could just hear the pins drop and you were waiting for someone to say, really? And eventually somebody did. And I went, no, it's not. But why are Christians, maybe this is one of the reasons why I've got a real bee in my bonnet on this, as to why Christians are falling by the wayside. They haven't given up on God, but they're given up on church, or they're desperate holding on to God. Maybe we're getting to the cusp of it here now, is that due to Christian urban myths, due to high organised religion that you're talking about, the hierarchy, Christians are gullible and will just want to hold on to something. So in light of your ministry so far, what do you think?
I think it's more than that. I think that we kind of Jesus. I think we sold a faith that said, come to Jesus and he will keep you safe. And I remember when I was converted, the guy doing the prayer had a pencil in his hand and he said, now you've prayed this prayer, you're a Christian. And then try and take this pencil out of my hand. And I'd try and say, just like that, God has you in his hand and he won't let you go. The inference in that faith was, in those early days, is God will keep me safe. Nothing bad will happen as long as I'm following God's will. And it was very fear-based. And those of us who were scared, like me, I was living a wildish life as a young teenager and I was looking for something to keep me safe. I couldn't trust my own mind. I'm quite hyperactive. And so it was just what I needed. And so much of it positive. I'm not saying that we throw the baby out with the bathwater, but that was what was attractional to me. But when I look at scripture, Jesus said, what they did to me, they will do worse than they did to me to you. They killed him. They ridiculed him. They criticized him. They banned him from their synagogues. They criticized him for hanging out with poor people and prostitutes. And he was a discipler. If we talk about successful discipleship, Jesus' 12 disciples, he only had 12 to focus on. Some of us as ministers have, church after church after church. He had 12. He was the professional in this. And what happened to them? They denied him. They were killed. They ran away. They betrayed him. I think the one that did all right, I can't even remember who it was now, the name, but became a minister, and that's kind of penance and, punishment enough. They were beheaded. They were locked in prison. And then somehow Jesus is the ultimate discipler, I think, modelled a loving brokenness and us seeing God in all things and all people to see God's kingdom come. But we went and said, true Christian discipleship looks like you don't smoke, you don't drink, you don't swear, suddenly have financial prosperity. And even those of us not in the prosperity religion still had that, will you give our 10% and then God will bless us. I remember a friend of mine, Dave Andrews, was saying at a talk once, I'm so sick of Christians saying, I was driving to church and it was raining and I'm praying for a car park. And then this person pulled out and God gave me this car park. And then they've ignored 5 poor old ladies walking in the rain. So does God not care about those people? And so all of that was always sitting at the base of my faith, making me feel uncomfortable about so much of what was being taught and not knowing how to describe it. So I think we did the best we had with what we knew. We didn't have internet. There was the only way to find out things was to go and hear someone speak. I think we have a very different world now where we can go online, we can research things for ourselves, and people taking a bit more personal responsibility for their own beliefs, which can be good and bad. The other thing that I think is our definition of church is completely wrong, and that hasn't changed even for those in the deconstruction movement. Church was never meant to be 1 or 2 hours on a Sunday. Church was always meant to be the whole of life. The Christian community, like in Acts, living out, loving widows and orphans, visiting people in prison, visiting the sick, doing justice, loving kindness, walking humbly with our God in our community. And then once a week, or maybe more than that, we do it more than that, you get together to celebrate what God has done in and through us as we take these risks and radical steps out in the community, or to lament. And sometimes for our community, we have a lot of death because we have a large percentage of our congregation are people with substance misuse issues. And so we have a lot of deaths of younger people. And so some Sundays, church is just crying together. Last Sunday, church was, an ABBA song, I Have a Dream, and looking at how life has kicked the dreams, God's dreams in us, out of us, and how do we help each other see those dreams again and live the way God intended us to live. And that's not about, I'm going to stop drugs or smoking or drinking. That's about what gift do you have in your hand to bring to the table? What is it that you're good at? What is it that we need you in our neighbourhood to do together with us? So I feel like changing the definition of church. So what church then became is all things to everybody. It had to meet everybody's total Christian needs for that 2 hours on a Sunday. Well, we went back out into the neighbourhood to live just like everybody else, buying our houses and our cars and being really busy, work, and all of our secular pursuits. So I feel like that has been the disconnect or between what we say we believe and what we really believe, which is demonstrated in what we do. The dissonance gets too much and forces people to let go of one or the other. And sadly, most people let go of their faith before they let go of their capitalism and their business models and their busy lifestyle.
Take it further then, please, Anji. You made that little comment earlier on about, you wanted to go out and save the world and you had God in your pocket.
Yeah.
If I could put you in my time machine and take you back to just when you're about to go out on that and say, look, here is Anji now. This is what she's learnt. What would you say to your younger self, and how much of a difference would it actually make, do you think?
And interestingly, in September last year, I went to Thailand for 4 months and to work with Burmese refugees, and it was completely different. You start with Lao Tzu, who was a Chinese philosopher, not an Irish monk, as I often misquote. He said, what is it? Go to the people, live with the people, learn from them, love them. Start with what they know, build with what they have. And in the end, people will say, I've done it myself. And even that has colonialistic kind of doing to connotations. But that principle of just learning, and I think actually as Christians and as Christian pioneers, missional people, whatever we want to call ourselves, our job is solely and wholly to see other people succeed and to live out the abundant life God intended for them. So that is not about us. That is seeing people of peace everywhere, seeing the gifts people have and helping them to be successful in using them. So that's slightly different, isn't it, to the cost of my friendship is your soul. I will help you, but I want you to come to my church or pray a prayer. And actually seeing all of people as God's creation and allowing them to use those gifts God's given them, not starting with what we have, what we think they're missing, but starting with all the things we see that they have and that we have in common. When we went out to Thailand, and I wrote a reflection in another book that's out, Jesus and Justice, my chapter is written on this. I don't know what I thought I was doing. I thought I was going to be like Mother Teresa and work in the AIDS hospice. And, I'm not that nice. I get bored really easy. And of course, everyone dies. So what stories have you got to tell? What miracles do you share back with your mission supporters? And so I think, again, that challenge of it's okay to just go and love people and care for them as they die. That is my Christian duty. And that is it. That is good and pleasing to God in and of itself. That is the end goal. Whereas I think at the time, there was always this striving to see, well, God has me here doing this, but there's some greater good that will come of it. And realising that was the greater good to be there, to be a human presence as somebody passes and their suffering ends, that it was the greater good. And nobody needs to know about it. No books need to be written about it. No churches need to be planted from all of those people that died, raising from the dead or whatever that is God's call on my life, was to be there in that moment and not to keep striving for this other thing. And again, why do we strive? Because we're conditioned with this idea of church growth. If it doesn't equal people coming to our churches, maybe we've failed in that task. So hopefully I would do it differently. I've made new mistakes. I made loads of new mistakes last year. And then I've come back all embarrassed. Oh, why did I do that? Oh, that was so cringe. Oh, that was such white colonialist me coming out, But also just recognising that we will mess up and that people that we're friends with have grace, don't they? And if we have genuine connection with people, they also will forgive us for our weird, unconscious Christian hang-ups that we have.
Obviously, what you've done in the past 25 years, I couldn't do what you do. But to your younger self, what you've learnt now, would you have still gone to Thailand?
Yeah, I think I would have done it differently. Yeah, the question of that whole, do we need white people going and living in a slum in Asia and spending all that money having to learn language? And I think I would see what my role was as completely different. And I don't think there's the same need for it now in the era of internet and globalisation that we have. But I think the gift that we can bring, and Aung San Suu Kyi, who's a famous democracy activist, currently somewhere in solitary confinement in Burma, she used to say, use your freedom to promote ours. And I think in that same way as use your faith as a Christian, use your power, use your freedom to help people see us, is what I would say. So the people that we love in Thailand in that slum are the real heroes of the story. And they deserve for people to see them and encourage them. And the feedback when we left was nobody sees us, nobody knows what we do. And that thing in all of us as humans, life is tough. And one of the things we have as Christians, which is a real blessing from the church, is we get to go to things that help us feel better, where people go, oh, what you did was amazing. Oh, encouraging us. People want to pray for us, want to hear about our week. How did it go last week? I've been thinking of you this week. In kind of privatised and disillusioned communities that we live in, neighbourhoods, people don't have that. They don't have that cheer squad. They don't have the people that care about them, want to hear about their week, particularly people with no family, who are isolated from their families. And for the poor in urban slums, the same. These people are incredibly gifted people. Pooh, whose cooking school we're part of and is quite known, and I won't tell that story, she is one of the world's best cooks, and she is now known for that. So we were able to just help Pooh stand up, to see hope and gifts in people that can't yet see it for themselves, I think is really that role. I think I've lived the life that my teenage self as a new Christian was desperate to live and was terrified I might never get to do. I've taken risks. I've been out there. But I think probably I would have enjoyed it more along the way had I known what I know now. And I would have felt less conflicted about some of the kind of weird Christian expectations that we have. And I'm still unpacking that. It doesn't go away. It's still, I was helping a family prepare for a funeral that I'm taking this week. And always in the back of your mind is, they're not church people. Should I be doing more, saying more at this moment? And my heart is, people are in pain and grieving. Just love them. Be genuine in your love for them. Don't have an alternative agenda for what they need in their life. Be a genuine friend, a genuine minister to them. And don't try and use this moment to sell them a product or, a faith journey. It's between God and them, and they will come on that journey if Christians are kind to them. That's what I believe.
Yeah.
Instead of Christians trying to treat them as a project. Yeah.
For those who want to know more about Pooh, listen to episode 114 with a person called Ash Barker, who may or may not be related to today's guest, Anji Barker.
Or you can look up cookingwithpooh.com, which is very famous, world famous. That's how we actually came to the UK the first time. We came to film with Jamie Oliver, and she's also on Jamie Oliver's Food Tube. So you can find all the details about her incredible story. And she's a phoenix who keeps rising from the ashes. But there's so many of those people in the communities that I live in. And Birmingham is no different. We have some incredible survivors, people who are just the hope of our neighbourhood and do incredible things. It's their stories to tell. And what we do is help create a platform so they can tell them. And not those kind of poverty porn stories, those Christian voyeuristic stories. I was a sex worker and now I'm a Christian. And, I think Christians, you did raise that before, Christians like to live vicariously through others. And if we were busy making the world a different place, we wouldn't need all of those stories. And, we'd all be living our own story. Every neighbourhood has these exciting stories to be lived. Doesn't matter where you are in Birmingham, in Oxford, in Bangkok, there are incredible stories waiting to happen. And we love what we get to do in Winson Green. And we laugh and we cry probably every day. Our latest drama in our street is we have the phantom pooer. We have someone that poos on our driveway, right in the middle of our driveway. And it's quite a public place, but no one's caught them yet. So we have our household of 11 people. We just see the evidence. So we do make a bit of fun of things in quite a tragic environment. Our neighbourhood is full of rubbish. Our bins haven't been collected for 7-8 weeks. There's piles of rubbish. There's a huge rat We also have rat catching competition at the moment to work out who can get this big rat that's eaten through a wire grate. There's fun to be had and adventures to be had. You might not all like the poo and rat adventures that I enjoy, but in every neighbourhood there's these great adventures. And it's just so sad that often Christians miss out on that, sitting in churches trying to plot and plan how can we get people inside our buildings, which if they're not there, they're not coming. Why doesn't we get the church out into the neighbourhood? And that's a much more fun place to be. And if anything, it's strengthened my faith. And I feel like I'm more Christian than I've ever been. And even though some of the rhetoric might sound more liberal, it's not. I think we see God at work and I have to trust that God is all powerful, that he does miracles. Almost my full charismatic Pentecostal self comes out in the neighbourhood because I'm never in control and it's always way out of my skill set with what I have to deal with. And so relying on God to be really tangibly present with his Holy Spirit is all I can do, because I've got no clue half the time.
You've made a reference about people aren't just going to come to church. You've also made reference about your faith and your doubts, but hey, you're still there. There are people who still believe in God but aren't going to church. In light of the fact that you are part of the synod for the URC, what can we do about it? And maybe is it time to say, do you know what? You don't actually have to go to church anymore. Forget this 2-hour slot on a Sunday. What do you think? Tell us more.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the studies here, England being quite different to Australia in a lot of things. Do you know what the biggest registered religion is in the UK?
Is it Star Wars thing?
No. A lot of people, particularly in Birmingham, would say, Islam. No, it's people who used to go to church.
Wow.
That's the biggest representation, no longer Christian. So I think that says something big, doesn't it? But I think obviously I've talked about, I think our definition of church is problematic. But in that, the question is, in 100 years' time, what will be the visible presence of Christianity in this country? And I'm passionate about that. I want to see that because, I'm very aware of the whole emerging church movement, and we were starting our organisation and mission at the time that was all coming out. And what happened is a lot of church buildings were sold and money was invested in these kind of emerging church, cafe churches, pizza churches, all sorts of things. Now, most of them do not exist anymore 20 years on. And you can say what you like about the institutional church, but if you're feeling suicidal in any city in the UK, you can find a cathedral and hopefully a person of peace, a Christian person that can pray with you, that can help you. If you're homeless, you speak to a big percentage of my congregation have been street homeless. They will all say that it's churches they would go to first. That's probably how they found us, to get help. So what will be the legacy of the deconstruction movement? People who are followers of Jesus, but we don't like church. And I count myself as one of them. And find church boring. I can't sit still. I've always found the structure and the buildings, physical buildings, I find really depressing. But I'm a firm believer that Jesus calls us to be the light and the hope for this world. And there needs to be, if you don't have obvious entry points, you become a clique and you become exclusive. And one of the things we do have about the places are really important is that people know where those places are and can go for help and find entry. So it's reimagining church. And, the term pioneer is what's used for my role. I know it has horrible colonial connotations, but call it what you want to call it. It's not about just tweaking the edges. It's not about just, and I think that sadly that's happened for Messy Church and Fresh Expressions. We've just tweaked the edges and it's still the two hymn sandwich and still has some of those forms, but we just give it a different name and have a bit of clay and paint. And I think we're looking at whole different ways of worship. And what's exciting is there's loads of them across the country. There's people who do forest church, there's people who do walking on the beach and mandalas and painting. Our church is a roller skating rink, so we have holy rollers. And
Whoa, hold on. Your church is a roller skating rink.
Well, we've got this huge big building that was largely, a handful of white people in an all-black community pretty much. And in COVID, a lot of our black community went back into roller skating. And I'm a child of the 70s, a teenager of the 70s, and I used to roller skate. So I'm like, let's roller skate in the church. And we had very firm, that horrible church carpet you have that's kind of hard downstairs. And upstairs was completely derelict. And until just a few months ago, we didn't have any money to make it safe to use. So we couldn't use the wooden floor. So I got a pair of roller skates, had a skate around, thought we can skate on here. So we just started roller skating sessions on, we had to rip up the pulpit and the stage and make it, create a bit more room. And then you just put your chairs back for when you need to do other things. And so for about 4 years, we've been roller skating there. And then earlier this year, we were able to do up the upstairs. and polish the floorboards. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a big roller disco. But my thing is, if people love doing things, the joy that brings, that comes from God, that's in and of God. And if you hang around any Rastafarians, all of that music comes from spiritual places. And so you get it. Every church needs a DJ. You get a DJ, you roller skate round. And one of the most pivotal memories of 2 weeks ago that I just loved, we have our disco lights because you need those. That song, and I'm really bad at music, you'll know, I Am Free, I Am Free.
If it's anything after the year 2000, I won't know.
But here was a group of Jamaican men skating and dancing, praising God with their hands up, singing this song, I Am Free. Yeah, it was incredible. And I was like, how can you say this is not church? And this is where the church model just hasn't moved. There aren't thousands of people out there in the neighbourhoods just waiting for an invitation to church. The people that like church, as we currently define it, are already in those buildings. And the people that are out in the communities are out there because there's already so many of that style of worship. We don't need any more of it, be it the Penty version, the contemplative version, the more fundamental version. Enough. Christendom, I think, is dead and gone. I think what we're looking for is in palliative care, in a sense, and let's bless people who like that. It's not wrong. It's what meets their needs, but it's not meeting the needs of a new generation. So for the United Reformed Church, we should be the most attractive church to people under 30, because for years before it was even discussed on social media, we had a slavery reparation policy. We have an eco policy. We've always ordained women. We're fully inclusive. All of those things should make us incredibly attractive to the under 30s. The bit that doesn't is the 1 hour on a Sunday that we call church.
Yeah.
So as we open up that imagination, it's got to be, I think, connected to our places and sometimes, sadly, our buildings, so that in 30 or 40 years, it doesn't just become a vanity exercise that I enjoy roller skating, so my church does roller skating, or I like beach walks or forest things, so mine's a forest church, which then dies off with the founder because other people like different things. It has to be a true understanding of new ways to worship God together and to live out our faith. And that is taking a lot of unpicking, because that has to be both and. It has to be valuing all the differences that we have. And I remember there's a church in Australia that we used to speak at, and it had all of it together. It was a mainstream Church of Christ church, but it had, the mainstream family service. You'd probably call it similar to a Baptist service, but there was a group of people that got disaffected and really wanted a contemplative Taizé type service. So what the minister cleverly did is said, great, well, why don't you do that at the same time? Here's another room, and then we can meet for coffee together. So we stay as one congregation. And then from that, another group broke off and wanted to be more Pentecostal type worship. So instead of that being an issue for the church, they then ran at another overlapping time, and the churches all met. So the first two churches met in the morning, went to their separate things, and then the more charismatic kind of young people service, they started afterwards, but they started with coffee at the end of the service of the other two. So they were all in fellowship together in difference, but nobody had to worship in a way that wasn't meaningful to them, if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense.
And I see that as a model across our neighbourhoods. What does a neighbourhood look like? Invite the neighbours in to dream, Christian or not, who cares? This is their building. What would you like to see happen here? And that's certainly what we've done in Lodge Road in Winson Green. We opened the doors, and don't rent your buildings to make money. If anybody lives locally, let them use it for free. It's their building. And when you start to do that, people just are completely shocked. They're wondering what agenda we have. No, just bless them. This is your building. We would love to see you do your dance group, and you're a dance teacher. Isn't that lovely? And isn't it great that we have that in our neighbourhood? And we promote them and we bless them. And that just changes the whole narrative of what it means to be Christians doing life in a neighbourhood and the church. And so many people would say they are part of Lodge Road Church that don't necessarily come on the Sunday service, but are there every day of the week, but are not using the building as a welfare centre, but are part of the church, part of the family, in a really fair way. So I'd love to see that across our neighbourhoods where URC churches are in the West Midlands. And we're starting to see a little bit of hope there that this can happen. And I also think you have to live where you worship. With a few exceptions of gathered churches that are city centre churches where people can't afford to live. When you move to a new neighbourhood, go and join something there and be the best volunteer that they have there. Don't commute away to somewhere else, because then you stay lonely in your own neighbourhood. So the hyper-local, the presence matters, being a presence, being available, and being generous and loving. And that to me is the basis of do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God, Micah 6 verse 8. That is the beginning, the launch pad of our Christian expression. And then we talk together about, Palestine, Israel, what's going on there? What are the things that concern us about the bin strike? What would Jesus' position be in this? How do we as Christians be true followers of how Jesus taught us to live in these situations? What risks are we taking for our community? That makes much more sense than for a throwaway line of belief we say we have. We only, I think, believe what we do. We can say we believe loads of things, but in the end, we only believe what we do.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, you're talking complete sense. The idea of giving your building away free, especially is the fact that it was built 150 years ago, however long it was, for the community. You're giving it back to the community. There's a basic kingdom principle here saying, well, come on, use it. We're here for you. My only concern is that by giving it away free, someone has to eventually pay for the electricity. So how do you factor that bit in?
So then that's what we do, is then we as a church say we are going to try and find the money. So I write for lots of bids and grants and try to find other ways to sustain it. Because that model, the other reason why Christianity was too slow, the Christian churches in the West in the last 20 years has been too slow to adapt to decline, is because the model, the business model, was based on numbers of people you get into your church fund stuff. And because I think money holds spiritual power, because we were tied into that model, all of our energy went on trying to get more people into the church. And, that's problematic for my congregation because nobody has a job. They're all on benefits, and a lot of them are not even on benefits. They're sanctioned or they're asylum seekers. So how do you sustain ministry in a church like that? Well, I had until, and I still do have another job that pays me. Is that bivocationalness, being willing to do with a bit less so that you're able to live the fullness of your own life, serving others. But we also find that as you're generous with people, and this might be some of my Christian kind of tithing superstition coming back to haunt me, I'll give an example. During COVID, we took over the building and all the services and places were closed, but there was nowhere for drug reduction support. And because all the official funded offices had to stay closed for legal and liability reasons, the drug workers were very frustrated. So we said, look, we're a big hub, a crisis hub, a big bubble of 60 people that were on the street anyway, so they all may as well be with us. Why don't you come and do your drug support work here? And they did. And they did that for years. And then they wanted to run these courses, and we're like, sure, you can run the courses, use the room, no problem. And then they heard that our bill was something, a few £1,000s, our gas bill. And they said, look, we've got funding for this. Why don't we pay you a year in advance to rent that room for a week every month? They generously have done that and continue to do that. So we made them succeed and they've helped us succeed. But that wasn't the agenda. That wasn't the starting point, because there's other groups that, a local guy wanted to do taekwondo. They don't have any money. It's very hard to make any money, let alone a salary, out of teaching sport or music and, that kind of gig economy, because of the way it messes up your benefits and doesn't allow you to have another job. We're like, just use the building for free. All we ask is that you let some local kids come for free as well. And so, again, it's a win-win. These guys used to live in the neighbourhood. They grew up there. Their passion was to do this business for themselves, but they're happy to let a couple of local kids be there for free. And they're never going to be financially able to contribute anything, but they're contributing something that's not financial, something amazing for families in our community who don't drive, who can walk across the road and have taekwondo lessons or kickboxing or whatever it is this week. So there's a whole lot of models of different ways, but it's always a challenge. We have a cafe that is a social support cafe. So we charge very little for food, but we don't give food away. So it means that everybody comes and eats together. And there, sometimes there's grant funding available. Sometimes we pick up a lot of food waste, and shops, when they close at night, give us their stuff. But that all takes a lot of people hours to do. It's much more labour intensive to do it this way. And so busyness is the challenge for Christians. The Christians are too busy to do it that way round often, because they have big lives outside of their church life, big middle class lives that don't mean you're free at 2:00 on a Tuesday to go and drive someone to hospital, or so you miss all those things. So I think all Christians should try and work part-time and be present in their community, and then you do all of life in a different way. That's my socialism coming out, I think. And there'll be enough to go around, yeah.
It's interesting you made that statement about we don't give away food for free, we do a basic charge.
Yeah.
Very quickly, what's the premise behind that?
Well, I think, firstly, I'm against food banks, and I know lots of churches found themselves in that place doing food banks. What I think food banks do is encourages grabbiness, and it's quite a shameful existence for people going begging. And food banks have changed quite a lot since COVID. It used to be you had to prove how poor you were, and we'd have to get a note to say that you're definitely deserving. But what has propped up a lot is food pantries, and we're involved in some of those where people can become members, and for £5 a week, you can get £35 worth of shopping, and you get to choose that shopping. So it's a bit more dignified.
Wow.
But I have still a problem with food pantries, because I think all the resources that Christian groups, particularly, but other groups that the charity sector is putting into food pantries, is propping up policy failure of our government. There shouldn't be such a massive need for these things already. And then the other side of food banks, particularly where no money is exchanged for people with substance misuse issues, it allows them to use more of their money for drugs and alcohol and to get free food. I mean, we've got people that I know very well who've probably never spent a cent on groceries in probably 3-4 years, because you can go from one food bank to another to another. And so for us, it's about helping socialise them to feeling proud of themselves again. So on payday, on benefit day, put £10 on the tick at the church cafe, and you can get a full breakfast for £2.50, an all-day coffee for £1, lunch for £2. But that means at the end of the month, when your money's run out, instead of hovering around looking for people to pay for your food, you've got money there on the tick. And the pride that people have, not just that they're paying, but that they then offer to pay for me. I mean, incredible, isn't it? And I think we've robbed the poor of the joy of giving by doing things to them and for them. And when we give, we love that feeling. I say giving is like peeing in a wetsuit, makes you feel warm all over. And I think that kind of thing, we love to give and to help people, don't we? We're humanly made. God has made us in his image to get this amazing endorphin rush when we've been able to help someone and love on someone and see something good happen. But yet there's a whole section of our community that never get that joy because they're always having stuff given to them instead of allowing them to give. And so I want to reverse that. And as horrible it is, I remember in Thailand, very, very poor neighbour, I'd helped her daughter, taking her to hospital or something, I can't remember what. And in exchange, she cooked me a whole fish. Firstly, I hate fish. But secondly, especially with the eye still on it and everything looking at you. But secondly, I realised that fish was 300 baht, and 300 baht was more than a day's wages. And she gave it to me. And I felt sick taking it. And every time I go back there, she comes running around with a fish, and I feel ill, not just at the thought of having to eat the fish, which I'm ashamed to say I don't. I pretend to eat it later. But the other is just that I know this is a lot of money for her, but she should be allowed the joy of giving and the joy of feeling that she's helped someone, and the bragging rights to be able to tell everyone about how she gave the farang, because I'm known as not being able to cook. Oh, Angie doesn't know how to cook, so I gave her a fish, I cooked her favourite. We say people are not problems to be fixed. People are assets to be realised. And as you see the assets in your community, people come in for help. I straight away think, what is it they have in their hand to give? What is the gift they carry? And if you've been homeless, you're a great homelessness worker because you know what it's like for other people. That lived experience is so powerful. Now, you can't succeed at that without somebody else doing it together with you who can maybe drive, who can do the risk assessment. So our job is to go alongside and say, you'd be a great worker helping other homeless people. Why don't we do that together? And that's the joy, I think. And to me, that's the future of the church in the UK. As we do things together in our neighbourhoods, we're improving our neighbourhoods for us as well. When people go, oh, what you do is amazing. No, it's not. I'm doing it for myself. I'm a foreigner here with no family in this country. I needed family. I was lonely and isolated, just like my neighbours are. So it levels that. It becomes that genuine connection. And in that genuine connection, I've really seen God's power at work.
All I can say on that one is two things, actually. Firstly, it reminded me that my wife and I wanted to bless a Christian family with a brand new mattress. And the justification I had to give because he wanted to refuse accepting it. And he was like a committed Christian and then started waffling around with all these Bible verses why I shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
It's like, you're robbing me of blessing you here. And secondly, I'd love you, if that's possible, to come back in the near future. And I'm going to put the ball back in your court, because you've got so much to share. And every so often I do a special podcast where we take a particular theme. So if there's a burning issue, Angie, that you would love to talk about, please let me know and we'll go for it.
Yeah, wow. Well, thank you. I mean, one of the things I love talking about is the reason so few people are willing to try this kind of model is you have no control over it. So it's kind of the chaos theory, isn't it? But what happens if someone, they'll say, yeah, that's happened to us. What happens if someone sets fire to it? Yeah, that's happened to us. What happens if you get robbed? Yeah, that's happened to us. Is that lack of control. So Ashot has a great talk he does about feed a fish, feed a man for a day, teach him how to fish. But if you keep going down that, natural conclusion to that is ask why there's no fish. So you start the political action, model a new way to fish, and then accept the fish from others. Yeah, is that whole thing of you're starting to ask those deeper questions of we're not just doing to, we're not just doing with, we're actually learning from and allowing our communities to serve. The reason churches do so much of the handing out of food is because you're in charge of that. Or we do things to people because we feel control is akin to spiritual. The amount of times the fruit of the spirit, peace and self-control has been quoted at me. But it's that control is the opposite of faith, not fear, not doubt. It's control. And we want everything to be nice and neat. And particularly in England, you guys that do it as professionals at the whole order and organising and everything being just so. So I think the chaos, moving into chaos to see God's kingdom come is really what I think we're doing here.
Right. Here's the challenge then, if you've got time, that is. But
yeah.
You know what you said, and I'm going back all the episodes. Every so often I say, how do you spell faith? And the answer is R-I-S-K.
Risk. Yep, that's exactly right. Risk. So often it goes wrong. And I think that's where we learn. So the fear, risk, when we talk about risk, I think in the West, we say, we've got to take risks, but we all still think about it in a safe way. We always think we're going to take risks and nothing will go wrong. The risk is, sue me. Yes, maybe that will happen. I've got nothing to lose. But the risk is, Jesus risked his life. And it wasn't because he had to die on the cross, be punished for our sins because God is a child abuser. It was because he stood up against the structures and the powers that be. And that, I think that's why he was killed. And we are called to follow him. He's the person we say we follow. So, yeah, a bit more risk. I remember I had to do a risk assessment. I worked for Oasis and they didn't like my risk assessment, didn't have stuff in it. And I said, well, as a Christian, everything I do will involve risk. So there you go. That covers everything.
And it got through.
Yeah, it got through. My boss rewrote it. So they didn't ask me to do another one, though.
So the very final question then. Anji Barker, who is your Christian hero, please?
Bishop Romero.
Tell me more.
Yeah, Oscar Romero, who was murdered for standing up for the people. I definitely think that he knew, he could have left. He knew he was putting his life on the line and he was murdered in such a terrible way. And people like that, Father Brian Nile and Father Brian Gore, they're probably both passed now, were both arrested and given the death sentence for supporting the Christian communities in the islands of the Philippines. And they were real social justice warriors before their time. So it'd be those people, I think, the people that paid the ultimate sacrifice and had a way out,
Well, between Oscar Romero and the two fathers, which one are you going to go for?
Probably Father Brian Gore because he was hot as well, so that helps, the hotness factor. My husband died of embarrassment.
I've never heard of him.
He's an Australian Catholic priest. There's a word for people who have the hots for priests. They're called black trackers. But anyway, no, it's not like that. But I was reading his book. It's called Revolution of the Heart. Really, Niall O'Brien was a Irish Catholic priest, and then Father Brian Gore was a Australian Catholic priest from Melbourne, my hometown of Melbourne, I think. And they were both arrested and given the death penalty for standing up for social justice for these Christian house church communities across the islands. I think it was the southern Philippines. I met him when I was halfway through the book and I shook his hand because I'd gone to hear him speak and said, oh my gosh, I can't believe I've met you. I'm reading that book and you've just got the death penalty and now you've ruined the book for me because I know you didn't die. And my husband was like, yeah, I'm really sorry about that and moved me on. But I just got starstruck and really awkward. Really, the true Christian heroes are the people you never hear about, aren't they? Again, my brain was very vague on all the details, but it's one of the things that inspired me to live a risky life and not to do things safe.
Anji, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll get my lawyers to talk to your lawyers regarding possible follow-up.
Yes,
Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's fine.
And if you haven't already done so, please hit the subscribe button. It would really mean a lot. Thank you very much indeed. Next time on Off-Grid Christianity.
I felt led to write the book during the pandemic about what the church might look like before Jesus comes back. I sense from Scripture the church is going to be radiant because we're going to be full of life and the power of the Holy Spirit. We're also going to be resolute because there's a lot of turmoil and trouble on the horizon. And we mustn't shy away from that. So we're not just expected the church to dwindle. We're expected to, I think the Lord expects us to be strong and to be full of life and following Jesus with all that we can. And what I've seen in the walks around Europe is just enforcing that. I'm seeing the church in many places, not organized church necessarily, but Christian believers really being bold in their faith and making a difference. A lot of street evangelism, a lot of church planting, a lot of good works done in the name of Jesus. The church is alive and well in Europe. But I also sense on there, there's a lot of nervousness about what's happening from Russia. There's a sense of, brooding trouble on the horizon. We're not just out of this yet. There might be some dark days to come. My takeaway from all of this is that I want my faith to be both radiant and resolute, to be on fire and strong. And I think that is going to be a mark of the people of God in the coming years.
Please join me and author, leader of House of Prayer and Methodist minister, William Porter. So until next week, cheerio.